Greetings and welcome back to another edition of MGTOW Talks. I'm here with my friend C.S. MGTOW, who, by the way, has recently put out some very good content, particularly his most recent video on the relationship of marriage to crime. He debunks a very common myth, and it's certainly the ideas he presented are very interesting and need to be explored further. But today we're going to be talking about a couple of things, mostly about sort of reevaluating the nature of participation in society, or civilization for that matter. Now, before we go into the actual participatory aspects of this, I first want to talk about, and this, by the way, had originally been planned as a sort of, I was going to script this and do it, but I thought it would be much more interactive and interesting if I talked to CS, because he's very well informed and competent on such matters. But to start, and I'll let him speak very soon, I wanted to talk about sort of an overstress, if you will, overemphasis on IQ. Now, I'm not one of these IQ deniers. I think most of the evidence I've looked at points out somewhere between a 60 to 80%, probably a 70% heritability. It's a genetic factor. There are absolutely racial distinctions. And IQ, if you look at the evidence, suggests almost with certainly that it's the biggest predictor of educational as well as economic success. But the problem with just proposing IQ, and a lot of this is based on my discussion with libertarian realists and lots of comments I've seen, is that it's part of a puzzle, or rather it's part of a picture. Yeah. IQ by itself isn't enough. So what I'm going to do right now is talk about the importance of ethics and ethical conduct and moral responsibility alongside IQ, because IQ doesn't guarantee that. So yes, I'm going to let you talk now. Maybe we can start it off that way.
Sure thing. Well, I guess what I've tended to see within the manosphere as of late is a focus on IQ as an absolute. So you only want a society of high IQ individuals, and of course it misses the points which I think you've discussed, which is very, very important, that you can have an incredibly high IQ individual who isn't ethical, and that isn't a net positive for that society if such an individual has power. And I think, of course, you've highlighted some really, really important examples of this, and we've seen this in the political process throughout history. So no doubt whatsoever, most of the presidents that the U.S. have had, possibly with the exception of George Bush, have been quite high IQ individuals, but their ethics certainly aren't there. You would have an example of, let's say, Bill Clinton, who I think is, he's obviously a very, very intelligent person, but in terms of ethics, he launched
classical political opportunities.
Absolutely. Lots of foreign wars of aggression, incredibly opportunistic in the country, broke every single campaign promise he made, and that was just seen as, well, that's just part of the political process.
And I might add, I did a bit of research on this, and it's not an absolute correlation, but there is a rough correlation, however, it's not absolute, but between a high IQ and sociopathy. That is to say, high functioning sociopath. So let me just give you guys a bucket list of some names. I think everyone's familiar with Henry Kissinger, yeah, who was the Secretary of State under Nixon, and this guy, to look at his background and how he acted and what he thought, I mean, I'll give you some quotes to give you an idea. This is what he regarded the American Constitution. In 1975, he was speaking to the Turkish foreign minister. He said, "The illegal we do immediately, the unconstitutional takes a little longer." And the other thing that he was heavily implicated in was the 1973, September 11th, is referred to as the other September 11th, assassination involving Pinochet, the dictator, yeah, and Salvador Allende in Chile, and he just created an immense amount of suffering. In fact, this is a direct quote from him: "I don't see why we need to stand by and watch a country go communist due to the irresponsibility of its people. The issues are much too important for the Chilean voters to be left to decide for themselves." And finally, this is a direct quote as well from the National Security meeting: "Assassination. Quote, it is an act of insanity and national humiliation to have a law prohibiting the president from ordering assassination," end quote. So this is a guy who clearly exceptionally bright. He graduated Harvard cum laude, and a very, very bright guy. His behavior is so clearly that of a sociopath who has no regard for. He has other quotes about carpet bombing in Cambodia. This is a fascinating thing. This guy himself was a guy who escaped Germany basically prior to the Nazi takeover. He happened to be ethnically Jewish, and he doesn't even. The emigration of Jews from the Soviet Union is not an objective of American foreign policy. If they put Jews into gas chambers in the Soviet Union, it is not an American concern, maybe a humanitarian concern. So, it's up for debate whether you think that's important. But my point is that this guy, he's lost his marbles when it comes to moral responsibility. You could argue maybe that's required for geopolitical interests. I don't know, but I would say you don't want a guy like him in charge of, being Secretary of State.
Agreed. And I believe there was another Secretary of State before him. I think it was Marilyn Albright who said we will use food as a weapon.
Well, yeah, she was quoted actually in the 90s as, as you know, in the 90s, throughout the 90s after the first Saddam Hussein uprising, if you will, the United States put sanctions in Iraq. It led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, particularly children. She was interviewed I think it was in 96, but I might have the year wrong. And she said, well, I think it's ultimately worth it. So another example of somebody who just clearly is a sociopath. I mean, the death of hundreds of thousands of children because essentially for petty revenge. They would, of course, argue as geopolitical concern. It's just, these people are not operating in the full day. And even beyond that, you take someone like Newton, who it's well documented. He had paranoid delusions. He was highly neurotic. He was a deeply unpleasant person to deal with, never mind his weird dabblings in things like alchemy and biblical prophecy. I mean, the guy was a genius, obviously. I mean, he's either the co-discoverer or the discoverer of calculus, which has transformed humanity, but so they're just, and then once again, Lloyd Blankfein, head of Goldman Sachs, very shrewd, dubious individual who we know bribed people, and he's just incredibly venal. But of course, I think in the realm of politics and economics, and particularly financiers, you almost have to be a sociopath, at least partially, to be successful. But I'm just citing these people as examples of people who are undoubtedly intelligent, but you really wouldn't want them to be in charge. And as a final example, I know I'm hogging the airtime here, I apologize, CS. I came up with an example of a guy with, say, 170 IQ who's a virologist, and he's the world's leading expert on rare and devastating viruses. And he thinks the best way to study this would be unleash one of these viruses on a major American city like Chicago or New York. Now, would you rather have him or a guy who is 30 points lower IQ who's deeply concerned about the ethical implications of preventing virus spread? I mean, just give it an idea that when we only stress IQ and we leave out these other factors such as ethical concerns, psychological stability, you're really missing a big chunk of the picture. And I deeply apologize. I'm giving the mic over to CS now.
No apologies necessary, my friend. And I agree with you. At one point, we have to make value judgments using criteria other than IQ to select politicians. And I think it's, for example, the example that I brought up the other day during our discussion was when airlines train pilots, they don't select pilots, strictly on the basis of technical ability. There's also a very, very big recognition that you can't have a pilot whose personality encourages them or predisposes them to risk-taking. When shit's hitting the fan, you want an individual who's not only competent at flying a plane, but also who's level-headed, who won't attempt anything fancy outside of the safe parameters of the aircraft. So what they do is that they'll select individuals who are very, very level-headed, in addition to being competent pilots, and these then form the individuals that can fly a plane across the Atlantic. An individual like myself, who I'm a huge risk taker. Even if I have the technical ability to pass a pilot exam, which I doubt, I certainly wouldn't pass their psychometric testing.
And thus you would be rightly disqualified from being a pilot.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we take an aircraft with 300 persons and we say, okay, we're going to disqualify people on the basis of potential, psychopathies or potential behavioral traits.
There's actually a perfect example from real life of this, yes. Remember last year, that German pilot who obviously he had the motor skills to fly.
Absolutely.
I think he flew a plane into some mountains in Switzerland.
Oh, yes.
And killed
Absolutely.
He had a history of depression, possibly anxiety, and it was, apparently his shrinks kept it hidden, but it just goes to show you could have the most amazing motor skills in the universe. If you have an anxiety disorder, no one should want you to be a pilot.
Exactly. Well, one of the other things, for example, with piloting is that, and I hope this isn't a kind of tangent, is that there's a body known as the aviation medical examiners, and what their job is to do is to make sure that, let's say, if the person is diabetic and insulin dependent, they're not allowed to fly a plane. So we take known risk factors of health and we disqualify people, but it seems to be in that particular scenario that one of the most important risk factors, which is the person's mental stability, was ignored, and we see this again and again within the political process, that individuals who, even without a clinical examination, are clearly disturbed, find a way into the political process, and because they're either incredibly narcissistic and a combination of other factors, they rise at the top. An example would be Robert Mugabe, who likely is suffering from some kind of a paranoid delusions, bipolar disorder. Of course, I'm not a clinician, but he has the classic signs of a sociopath.
Well, yeah, you quote. He has a famous quote: "The only good white man is a dead white man." So, the great video, by the way, recently where I heard about him begging the white European farmers to come back to run the farms. I think in particular politics and finance seems. These are niches or areas that seem to attract these types of minds more often.
Yeah.
Perhaps because it is difficult to get ahead, given the corrupt nature of let's face it, financial corporations and politicians, to get by being honest. There are some exceptions. Look at Ron Paul. Whether you agree with him or not, he overall tended to be a very forthright man who stuck to his principles. But his son less so, and it's just a difficult thing. And I think. You look at Barack Obama, who might have years ago been an idealist. He certainly was willing to throw all that away. And so when we evaluate people, you really need to think about their psychology through, perhaps psychometric testing. And the more important the position, like if you're a pilot, you're on a monthly basis, you're literally in charge of the lives of thousands of people. The company can't afford it, and society can't afford you to be incompetent. If you have an insulin dependency, a cardiac condition, anxiety disorder, depressive disorder, suicide, none of that can be permitted. You should get treated and not be a pilot in such a case. And this goes across the board. Now, in light of this, I've been thinking about an appropriate model. Now, as libertarian realist, as you know, there are all kinds of accusations that I essentially was agreeing with him. I wasn't. I have a different position. And I disagree with his position that, say, voting should just be, the reserve, as it were, for high IQ people. So I thought about a system with regards to voting and particularly political participation that would encompass all of these things. You want intelligent people, obviously. You also want ethical people. So the same test that you might apply to pilots and maybe police officers, you could apply to voters. And more importantly, what I'm going to propose is a sort of oligarchic system. But I don't think everybody is fit to vote. And I don't know if I've coined this term, but I call it existence voting. The current system, and this is what C.S. partly talked about, is you exist, you make it through some miracle in modern Western civilization to 18, and then all of a sudden is conferred upon you this ability to vote politicians. Now, you might be pretty dumb, you might be uneducated, you certainly have no life experience, and still you have this immense power to influence politicians. Now, I would propose, the very first thing I would propose is, just like the President of the United States has to be older than 35, so too should the voter. Life experience, that is to say wisdom, and your track record should be something that should be considered. We know, for a number of reasons, brain maturation, whether it's man or woman, the fact that you can have a work background that can be evaluated. Voting should not be predicated merely on your existence and you're a kid at 18.
Precisely. Yeah, I agree. And I think one of the other things that that possibly a lot of people should keep in mind with regards to the vote is that voting is uniquely powerful because it allows individuals as a group to compel state violence towards activities or non-conformance with a particular behavioral point of view. So, for example, if I believe everybody should pay a 90% income tax and I get enough people whipped up and we all vote for that, we vote some politician in, individuals who don't wish to pay this will find themselves in jail. And voting is incredibly powerful. So absolutely, individuals who are granted this privilege, and I don't believe voting's a right, I think it's self-evident that it isn't a right, should absolutely have to fit a certain criteria, which of course life experience may factor into it. Age absolutely should factor into it. And I agree with you, at the age of 18, I was incredibly idealistic, but I knew nothing about the world compared to, in my 30s now.
Mm. Yeah, and in the system, and it's fairly rigorous, I think actually voting, as well as politicians themselves, the qualifications for this should be age-dependent, obviously, and my idea that I propose is really only the best and brightest and most ethical people in society. So you would have rigorous psychometric testing. People would need to have a vast amount of knowledge of history of their respective countries, and in the West of European history as well, Roman law, Greek philosophy, science, like, for example, biology, human evolution. That's so important to understand anything when it comes to society. Economics, all of these things would have to be tested and evaluated. And I would propose, maybe it sounds extreme to people, that at the final juncture, you would have to actually submit something like a dissertation that would be peer-reviewed by people who had gone before you. And then within this context, you could have a rotational system where the politicians who were elected would be former voters. Now, because there is rigorous ethical testing, psychometric testing, I wouldn't necessarily ensure, but it would help to prevent corruption in the ranks. So we wouldn't get people like Lloyd Blankfein and Henry Kissinger, who probably could pass the intellectual rigors, but would ethically fail the population. And I would argue I would be excluded because I'm not smart enough. Many people would be excluded. But let's really think what your average Joe Schmo, who has the power to vote, does. I mean, what does your average man do? He eats cheeseburgers, plays video games, likes to fuck women, and keeps abreast of Manchester United. What do most women do? They gossip, send text messages, post cupcake pictures on Facebook, and share using whatever these stupid, I don't even know what these sites are called. So, and go shopping. I mean,
agreed.
How would their lives be infringed upon or impeded by having essentially an oligarchic structure of the best of society making political decisions, who are also ethical at the same time? And I would argue that the basis of this problem we face is an egalitarianism line of thinking. I think this ultimately stems from an inheritance we have in the West that is a kind of almost utopian Enlightenment ideal that, yes, people will argue it wasn't about equal opportunity. It wasn't about equal outcomes, equal opportunity, but there was this belief that anyone can do everything, right? And this has been transmitted to us as well. I mean, this is what we have these days, is everyone is sort of uniquely competent to vote, and everyone is uniquely competent to X, Y, Z. We see a loosening and a reduction in the standards to be a fireman and a police officer, and this is bad.
I agree. And again, I think there's people to keep in mind that if an individual doesn't have privilege, they can still practice a religion of their choice. They can move freely around society. They can live wherever they choose. They can practice, freedom of expression. They can print whatever they want. The only thing they wouldn't be allowed to do is to use the ballot box to compel their neighbors to certain actions, because essentially, for all intents and purposes, they're unsuitable for doing that. Because, let's say, either hypothetically they're not smart enough, or they're, if the person is clinically depressed. And again, this isn't knocking an individual with, who's suffering from clinical depression, but it's just to say, for this particular activity, until you get this sorted out, you're not able to perform that. In the same way, I wouldn't want my pilot suffering from clinical depression.
Well, we saw what happened with Lufthansa. He flew a plane into a bunch of mountains.
Absolutely.
And this is something that we need to come to terms with. Egalitarianism as a concept has failed us. We need to acknowledge that people are different. Some people are just plain dumb. When I worked in the warehouse for almost 3 years, someone who had previously spent most of his time teaching and translating and essentially in a semi-academic environment, I was exposed to levels of stupidity I had personally not witnessed in my life before, because I had spent, most of my jobs prior to that, teaching and translation, are white collar, but I was lugging around crates and stuff like that, and some of these people were just as dumb as bricks, frankly speaking. Mind you, white German men for the most part. And their interests were, the football match, fucking, playing video games, some celebrity TV show, whatever. And trying to have a conversation beyond the mundane was absolutely impossible. Now, that's just a reality. There are a lot of dumb people, and there are people in the middle. I don't think I'm that smart. I don't think I'm dumb, but I wouldn't be part of this theoretical elite that would vote. If only because I'm not smart enough. Maybe I have problems with my psychology. I don't know. But I think we need to drop our idealism about the human condition. As MGTOW-minded men, we're aware of the differences between the sexes. And I would argue the system I'm proposing is colorblind and genderblind. If women could actually, in whatever case, pass all the examinations and pass the psychometric filters, and they would be free to do so. There probably would be, by default, fewer women, but and any person of any racial profile could do so as well. It would ultimately be up to them, but and their capabilities. But we need to just drop this notion that everyone is somehow uniquely gifted to do just about anything, and particularly in something as important as government participation.
Agreed. In fact, when the vote was initially established, in Greece, it initially was the kind of purview of a very, very small select group of men for a reason. Not only were these men expected to take a very active role in the running of the state, but they also militarily fought on behalf of the state during times of invasion or foreign aggression. So it wasn't simply conferred on an individual for breathing, the existence that voting that you've pointed out, earlier on. And the consequences of expanding the voting franchise, downwards in terms of age and across gender lines have been absolutely devastating. We have an out-of-control welfare state which will likely bankrupt Western civilization at one point. You cannot print that much money for that long without suffering some form of hyperinflation. We have an erosion of liberties because individuals come in and say, I'm offended by that. Okay, so they'll shut down the ability to express oneself, on a governmental level. You have the guy in Canada pulled in, to court, and lost his job for disagreeing with feminists online. So this is the direction of when you expand, the voting franchise to people who quite honestly just shouldn't have ever had it in the first place.
And the theoretical model I'm proposing would effectively keep money out of politics, because you would have this rotational system. There would be peer review, and the government by default would be small, because you couldn't just funnel money in because it would be the smartest, most ethical people. They would be not the Bill Clintons clearly probably could pass such examinations and what have you, but because of his ethical conduct, he probably wouldn't be subject to voting and political participation. So I think we need to. This this is stuff that people realized a long time ago. You're absolutely right about Greek democracy at the time. I mean, and which is not to say not everything they endorsed was great. I mean, they thought slavery was great as well. That was just sort of the lay of the land at the time, or the cultural lay of the land. But there's certain ideas that we've inherited from the past that almost have been superseded by more a kind of youthful optimism that began in the late 17th and particularly in the 18th centuries, where people began to think, yeah, humans can do anything. And this is it's a noble thought, I suppose, but when it comes down to it, like I said, I've worked with just fucking idiots before. They were just dumb as bricks. I've also worked with and met people far smarter than I was. And I've actually known a number of unfortunate sociopaths and psychopaths in my life who were actually, some of them were quite smart, some of them not so smart. So I'm basically 40, so I have this range of experience. I've seen it all, and I'm saying here that I shouldn't be allowed to be part of this voting or political bloc, but it wouldn't affect me because the things I like, my intellectual interests, taking walks in the park, producing video content, it wouldn't affect it at all. And I think we need to have an honest discussion on this. And people have been so blind. You look at Noam Chomsky, and I've brought him up numerous times before. I mean, his linguistic stuff is quite interesting, and I think it's relatively accurate based on my limited understanding of how to practice. But I mean, he actually thinks that everyone is just uniquely competent to participate in government, and men and women are identical. I mean, he talk about compartmentalization. But I also don't necessarily think that the sort of responsibility model is the best, because it's helpful, but ultimately you want people who are interested, ethical, and intellectually competent to do these things.
Agreed.
And it's funny because, as you pointed out, we have these sets of rules in things where it matters, such as piloting massive jumbo jets. To a lesser degree, I suppose, you have the physical tests and firefighting, although they've been dropped to certain degrees, police officers, and so on and so forth. Academia is hopelessly corrupt, and a lot of it is bullshit, but the premise that you need to engage in examinations, write a dissertation, which is then committee reviewed, is not a bad one per se.
Great.
Which is to say, you can't just walk off the street and say, I'm going to teach economics, I'm going to teach Roman history, when your only claim to fame is you read an intro book to Roman history or whatever. So I think this is something is probably pie in the sky, actually almost certainly is, but unless society wakes up to the reality that egalitarianism isn't just a complete failure, it just bankrupts society and destroys everything we hold dear. And it's not necessary to enjoy the things we enjoy.
Precisely. In fact, I think it was Winston Churchill who said that the best arguments against democracy is a 5-minute discussion with the average voter. And I guess as I mature, I really, really see the limitations with the current mass enfranchisement voting system. The ability for people en masse to just, with very, very little knowledge of economics, say, I'm going to vote for that guy or that woman who probably has just as little knowledge of economics as themselves, and that individual is now in charge of monetary policy, and they'll expand the monetary supply to then satisfy whims of the voting masses. There's very, very little desire to factor in long-term consequences into economic decisions because of this very, very odd and actually very, very young democratic process that we have. For me, the way democracy currently works isn't working. It's destroying the very, very basis which we all hold dear, the freedom of speech, the freedom of expression, and also just the ability to be secure in our person. So for example, if I've worked hard to make, let's say, 1,000 euros today, what I really don't want is a central bank printing money day and night to make sure that 1,000 euros only buys 500 euros worth of stuff next year. So I do have very, very grave concerns with the democratic system as we currently have it.
Yeah, and I'm not arguing, by the way, here for a plutocracy. I think, if you wanted someone, maybe ideally this would be some sort of minarchist system. So maybe for a nominal fee, or it could even be, paid for the government. I think at this point in time, a no tax system wouldn't be workable, but maybe a flat 10%, which would include all the basics. And anyone could try to study the coursework, study the economics, study the science, and whether or not they got in would be something, up to them and their individual capacities. But even the founding fathers of the United States, you could argue it was sort of plutocratic, but they didn't think that the common man should have much of a say in things. And, you got to go where the evidence leads you. And the common man, to be perfectly honest, is a fucking idiot and uninformed. And I can walk by the street where I live and listen to the conversations they have. And, I mean, I'm sure, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, I was in a cafe where I frequently go, to be fair. And in years, I've been going there for years. In say 3 years' time, I heard a conversation about politics and something that was off the normal charts of the boyfriend broke up with me, or I got laid the other night, or this is too salty, or whatever. So should people whose general concerns in life are just those sort of mundane things, whether it's women with their gossip and cupcakes on Facebook, or women or men who, and I'm not faulting them for it. I like playing video games, but play video games and getting laid. This is not a good basis for political and economic participation of the sort that exists in the current model.
Agreed.
And the evidence, I think, is just irrefutable. You shouldn't have dumb people, and you shouldn't have unethical people. At the moment, we kind of have I would say, obviously smart people can and do succeed, but they have no inhibitions with regards to their unethical behavior. I mean, look, we all know what happened in the mid-2000s with mid-late 2000s with the bailouts and Goldman Sachs. And if Lloyd Blankfein were an ethical man, he would say, I made mistakes. I should suffer the consequences, and I'll rebuild. No, instead he was wholly beyond for the government bailouts, and these are not the kinds of people we want in charge. Another example of this is Martin Shkreli, this young guy from New York, actually, who raised a medication price by 5,000%, and because it's profitable. I don't doubt that makes it more profitable. The question is that ethical? And that's a different. That's a different concern. And this is, I should hope, illustrates the difference between somebody like, well, frankly speaking, libertarian realists and these other people who just rave on about IQ endlessly. That is not, I would rather have an ethical person who might not be quite as intelligent doing important things, such as being a virologist, working with deadly viruses, than somebody who thinks, yeah, let's just unleash virus XYZ into the Chicago population and see how it festers. We're going to get amazing data from this, and science will progress as a result.
Sure.
This is not what we want. I think most people could agree with this.
I agree. I guess another, just on the topic of Lloyd Blankfein, about 2 months ago, he issued, or their bank, Goldman Sachs issued a suggestion to all of their clients saying, look, we recommend that our clients short gold. Now, a lot of clients did, and they ended up getting really, really burnt. And what they didn't understand was one arm of the bank will be saying to their clients, hey, short gold, because another arm of the bank wants to buy gold really, really cheap. And these individuals, there's no morals, zero scruples. So if you happen to be a client of the bank, and of course you expect the bank will give you the soundest advice for your investments and aim to increase the value of your holdings, you'll find yourself on the other side of transactions with them, and they will burn you. And you're completely right. These are the types of individuals that seem to be attracted to those kind of roles, who are, for all intents and purposes, just amoral.
Yeah, they're obviously very smart. I mean, people rant on about, well, they're not really smart, they're just conniving, but even that, I mean, they're smart.
Oh, yes.
To work a system like that, you need to be smart, but these are not people. Obviously, I was against the bailouts. I mean, despite what people claim, I recently was called a socialist by some idiot who listened to two sentences of my talk on these old Korean women who prostitute themselves out. I had stated something to the effect of, because there's no welfare system and their kids aren't taking care of them, this is what they're resorting to. And he took that as an endorsement of worldwide socialism. And this is a perfect example of a guy who should not be voting. The guy was an idiot. He had a "don't tread on me." He said, "I have a trained ear and a trained nose. I smell a socialist." So, but, and this is a bit off topic, but that's an example of someone who shouldn't vote. But yeah, I think finance and politics in particular, that is an area where you tend to get high IQ, high functioning sociopaths. And you might argue that anyone occupying a particular, I mean, Alan Greenspan, he probably has some sociopathic tendencies. Same with basically every other federal chair. Undoubtedly, they're smart people.
Oh, for sure.
And probably a bit megalomaniacal to think that you can just essentially run the world.
For sure. I mean, particularly, for example, when one analyzes Greenspan's writings, his essays at the start of his career, you find a far more,
very free market.
Oh, precisely. Very, very libertarian. He really, really understood the impacts of runaway money printing on pricing. He argued very, very strongly for a very small central bank that didn't interfere with the political process and didn't try to prop up a particular political ideology. As soon as he then took over the reins of power, he did the very, very same things that he spent 20 years arguing against. And really, just absolutely incredibly, he caused multiple financial collapses. And you could...
Well, we're still suffering the consequences from Greenspan policies.
Oh, for sure.
In early 2016.
Precisely. And he's he's no longer the Fed chairman. He's been out of the job for, 7 years now, Fred?
Yeah. Bernanke helped further cement his policies, and Janet Yellen is I guess doing a bang up job, at least from some people's perspectives. And you look at all these Fed chair people, because there's a woman now. All of them have this thing in common, that they think that secrecy and frankly speaking, venality are proper ways to conduct financial policy. The level of backtracking, and I've read the older Greenspan stuff as well. It's incredible. I mean, they seem like two different human beings,
Precisely,
don't they?
absolutely.
You look at what he did as Fed chair to what he had written. You're just thinking, oh, that's not the same guy.
Exactly. Well, in his earlier work, you could almost say that this is a von Mises or a Rothbard.
Yeah.
Now it's a straight up Keynesian. Keynesian approach. Let's just print money. We'll drop it down on helicopters.
And to be fair, maybe when you have a system as big as the American government and fiat currency as well as dollar reserve, maybe that's the only way to operate. But instead of saying, well, I don't want to compromise my ethics, can you imagine a Murray Rothbard saying, well, I'm going to become Fed chairman and I'm going to, inflate the hell out of our civilization? I don't think he would do that, because he would have real ethical concerns. And he wrote frequently on the subject of the ethical damage caused by monetary policies of the sort that the Fed endorses and practices. I think that's kind of the stopping point, where a willingness to compromise on these principles simply for the sake of ambition. Let's face it. Yes. I mean, the head of the Fed is arguably the most powerful person in the world on some level, and that's immense power. And whoever is greedy and ambitious will want that position. And if you're willing to take on that position, you're probably also willing to compromise on whatever principles you used to have. Same with the presidency. I mean, look back at Obama's earlier idealism, and now he's become a kind of hardened, quote-unquote, compromising politician. And, it might just be that to be an ethical person means that you can't be a financier, you can't be a Fed chairman, you can't be a major politician. Thank the gods, most scientists, the high IQ people or scientists, aren't involved in that. They tend to gravitate more. I think you get fewer sociopaths on that end. So this is something that we need to have an open discussion about in society on the whole, because this is paralyzing us. The egalitarianism model, from which, of course, existence voting is derived. You exist. Even, think about it, even driving, and I don't drive, but apparently it's quite easy. Even driving has a qualification.
Absolutely. Because we realize that a car is, for all intents and purposes, a metal weapon with acceleration. Absolutely.
Yes. And it's absolutely insane that people should be given this amount of power with their lack of. Really, people vote on, particularly women, but people in general, on visceral emotion. I talked about the Bernie Sanders fanatics, and there were many of them in the comment section of that video. And these people are not the kind of people who should be involved in the voting process. I shouldn't either, mind you.
Oh, same here. Same here. I wouldn't be allowed to vote. I know that for a fact, just in terms of my personality. So I agree. So. We're not arguing here, and please forgive me if I'm kind of, misrepresenting your position. We're not arguing that people like us be allowed to vote. It's simply a case that there are so many people who are clearly unsuitable to this task of voting, and it is a task. It's not a right. It's not freedom of speech. It's not freedom of religion. It's not, voting is not a right. It's a privilege. And this privilege must be earned. You don't earn it simply by coming out of a woman's womb and surviving to the age of 18. That isn't enough. And we've got to get past that idea as a civilization that people get to decide on things simply because they respire. There has to be more to define an individual's worth within the political process.
Yeah, and it's hysterical that be it a job or driving or a motorcycle license, we have to varying degrees tests and examinations and trials that people have to go through in order to be able to do something. It's just why this is missing in this other equation with voting in particular, and political participation as well, is a bit strange to me.
For sure.
And part of it, of course, is government size. The bigger the government is, the more likely it is to become corrupt and have money in politics. It's just easier to exercise oversight over a smaller government structure than it is, the massive system we have now.
Agreed.
But.
No, I was just going to say, I think you've raised a hugely important point there, which ties in with the political process that we have. In many ways, when, for example, we look back at ancient Greece, you had lots of little city-states. Democracy, or at least democracy of the kind that we're advocating, or even mass democracy, may work in this kind of city-state format. So, for example, with the direct democracy they have in Switzerland.
Switzerland is not too bad.
Exactly. And there's a real direct democracy, and it seems to work for something of that size. It's a small country.
Well, actually, Clive, come to think of it, when you think about the inception of the United States, so many powers, everything apart from what's in the Constitution was delegated to individual states to decide.
Precisely.
And that the notion of federalism, I think, is not a bad idea. It's just that we've striven in an opposite direction, and we've gone just way off board on that. It's for all intents and purposes, states do legislate things, and sometimes they can get away with it, like Colorado and legalizing marijuana to varying degrees. But the concept of the original American government, where you had a kind of a small government that would only really look at the big issues of maybe military involvement and something that somehow breached the Constitution, there's just been an incredible abuse of that. And And a lot of that has to do, once again, with the common person, the common man, the common woman allowing to vote. These people don't really even understand the notion of states' rights and the 10th Amendment, and the fact that on all matters, apart from the previous 9 amendments in the Bill of Rights, the states have full authority to decide. I mean, that's the thing. If New York State decided to completely decriminalize all drugs from heroin to cocaine to crack, New York State is completely within its rights to do so.
Precisely.
It couldn't do that under the current system because, well, the feds would basically raid everything and screw it up. But I think ultimately what we need is more autonomy of that sort. I mean, it wouldn't be quite what I'm proposing, but at the very least there would be less damage.
Precisely.
Because there would be less centralization there.
Precisely. The Founding Fathers in the United States founded, or at least put the Constitution together under a series of ideas, one of which was gridlock is good. The idea that you have a large kind of Leviathan central government or federal government deciding on everything for the states was an anathema to these guys. You know, they had just broken away from a large British rule, and for them, very, very much, each state was supposed to decide on most things on its own, that there certainly was no provision for a federal police force. The army, for sure, potentially had to be centralized, but even the states had their own, you know, the state guards. So what has happened over the kind of generations with the expansion of the voting franchise is a system of government which is probably ill-suited to a country that size. It's simply too large to succeed. You know, one federal government making a uniform policy for somewhere as diverse and vast as the United States, and we're seeing it doesn't work. The monetary policy that works for New York won't necessarily work for, let's say, Texas, which has a completely different economy, very, very different behavioral norms, and possibly even differences in IQ. Who knows?
Yeah, and I mean, to be fair, though, and it's something I admire about the states, is even so, even with all the burdens and the restructuring we've mentioned, you still kind of have a competitive market of ideas with regards to states. So, for example, if you don't like a super socialized tax system like in Massachusetts, you can go to a place that has much lower tax, such as, you know, North Carolina or New Hampshire or Texas. And so in some sense, you have a competing marketplace of ideas with regards to states, because states do have sort of tendencies.
Yes.
I am fairly atypical as a New York City, or as it were, because I'm not a liberal, despite what people claim. And overall, yeah, New York is a liberal state, high tax, high estate tax. It's you know, if you don't like that sort of thing, first off, I couldn't financially live in New York, that would be impossible. But if I were to move back in the States, I wouldn't live in New York because of the taxes and because of the tendencies. I would go to a different cultural milieu, if you will, maybe New Hampshire, because it's the only state in New England that has a more libertarian-minded society. But so you still have this to varying degrees. It's just that it's been over-compromised by a strong centralized government that is, I think, ultimately bankrupted the free market, free exchange of ideas within individual states. If you don't, for example, maybe your biggest issue is religious lunacy. So don't live in a southern state, live in Maine or something. I don't know.
Precisely.
So you have that, but I think this all just points back to the problem with big centralized governments. And
sure.
These people who advocate for it, I just don't understand from a practical point of view the limitations of imposing oversight on such a massive superstructure. This is just impossible. That's why I just don't see the ultimate benefits in it. Now, people often say, well, Stardust, you benefit from the German, you pay German health insurance and benefit from the single payer, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, that's not because I necessarily advocate that. It's because I live in this system. I live in this country. So I pay my monthly insurance and premium, and, that's what I have to do. I don't have a choice.
Precisely.
And it's actually illegal. It's funny, in Germany, they call it voluntary insurance, but it's illegal not to be insured.
It's that compulsory voluntarism, which is now becoming a very, very popular thing, where they'll say you don't have to do this, but then they'll arrest you if you don't do it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, ultimately, I still feel very minarchist about things. I'd like to see maybe just a 10% flat tax to cover all the basics, and more market competition in the realm of things. But you're not going to really see that. And I mean, a lot of what we're talking about is pie in the sky. However, it is theoretically possible, maybe at least in the context of the states, to get more of sort of state individualism and states' rights on certain issues. Because we know, for example, in Portugal that decriminalizing drugs has helped a lot.
Oh, that's been the salvation of their economy. When one looks at the sheer amounts of resource that was needed to run a war on drugs, the judicial system, the police officers, the specialized army units, the jails, who for all intents and purposes were locking up the kind
sick
of
people.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a medical problem.
Absolutely.
It's not a criminal problem.
Agreed. Non-violent people who actually need help.
Yeah.
You know?
If you're an alcohol addict or a crack addict and who hasn't actually physically molested someone or assaulted someone, you need medical and psychiatric attention. You don't need to be thrown in jail. That's not going to help at all. And that's what we have pretty much across most of the West, and in particular in the States.
Exactly.
But, you know, I personally think, and this is just my opinion, that there's too much bureaucratic interest, in terms of maintaining government jobs and all this other crap that tends to keep the war on drugs going along. And it just goes to show that people don't have the best interests of society at heart. The politicians don't. And, you know, it's pretty depressing. We kind of veered off topic here, but I think ultimately going back to this idea of not allowing everyone to participate, because anyone who's intelligent and ethical would see the senselessness, for example, of a quote-unquote war on drugs.
Exactly, absolutely. But particularly when that war doesn't target violent offenders. You know, that kid who's smoking a marijuana cigarette on the side of the road is bothering nobody but himself.
Or even if he's a heroin addict sort of languishing away, he needs medical attention.
Precisely.
He's suffering.
Precisely.
So it's a tremendous waste. And I can't wait to get someone from Mexico, someone who would... by the way, guys, there are more perspectives talks coming, but I have other things to do. Mexico in particular has turned into hell on earth because of the war on drugs.
Oh, precisely. Precisely. It's now one of the most dangerous places, or certain parts of Mexico
Absolutely.
Incredibly dangerous.
And the war on drugs, I mean, I know I keep on harping on this, but you have a company like Ubisoft making a game called Ghost Recon Wildlands, or Wildlands. I think it's basically just the whole game is about shutting down drug operations in Uruguay or something. I mean, that's how crazy the war on drugs has gotten, that you can make an entire game based around it.
For sure. And also then the ability of, let's say, US DEA agents to then, go across the border and start running, anti-drug operations in Mexico. It's expanding. So it's expanding issues that quite simply don't exist and turning it into just a huge international calamity.
Well, it's just bureaucratic interest and greed.
Absolutely.
I mean, people want to keep their jobs. The drug dealers love it because the black market, pushes up prices.
Oh, and it decreases quality. So they don't have to provide, high quality crack cocaine. They can provide garbage because they're essentially operating in a market where they don't have high quality competitors. So let's say, for example, if I'm a drug addict, I would rather a pharmaceutical company with high quality labs, trained chemists be manufacturing my crack cocaine or heroin, guaranteeing a certain purity, versus a crack dealer who watched a couple of episodes of Breaking Bad and now wants to get involved in the business.
Absolutely. I mean, that's an excellent point. Without legitimate market competition, you take what you can get, particularly if you're an addict.
Absolutely.
And you can see this. I mean, look at the most common drug in the world, I would argue, is alcohol, and there's a huge variety.
Precisely.
If you're an alcoholic, whether you want to get drunk on Jack Daniels or some cheap Coors beer or some classic English lager, that's up to you. I mean, I'm not endorsing alcoholism here. I'm just saying you have the variety, and if a beer is shit, people won't buy it, for example.
Precisely.
So
and there's legal recourse if they harm you. So if that crack dealer puts rat poison for some reason and to cut the thing, if you take it, you're on your own. What are you going to do? Say I went to buy crack cocaine? Well, you'll be arrested. But there's legal recourse if there's a free market for it. That individual will pay for harming you.
Well, and the other thing, Clive, that comes to mind is, and this is related to the egalitarianism model we've been talking about, is contained within that idea is also the recognition, and more importantly, the acknowledgement that there's always going to be some subsector of society that's going to suffer from some addictive behavior, be it nicotine or alcoholism or crack cocaine or heroin. It's just going to exist. So better to have somebody, as you pointed out, who's a quality producer, who's going to have controls through market competition.
Absolutely.
As well as legal resource then, because they're always going to be addicts of various sorts.
Agreed.
That's a better way of dealing with it. But there is just too much bureaucratic interest, and the people. I've always found that, I know we're veering off the topic a bit, but it is related. I've always found the left-leaning people who also endorse a decriminalization of drugs at the very least, or a shutting down of the war on drugs, is that they don't understand why it's going on, and that's because you have big bureaucracies who want to stay in power and to keep their paychecks coming in, running the operation. Without the hundreds of thousands of jobs that some probably involved in narcotics control and the war on drugs, I mean, there wouldn't be an incentive to keep it going.
Agreed, wholeheartedly. And just kind of coming back to the topic, that you brought up earlier, through the kind of Enlightenment movements, what's happened is that as society has progressed, what I've seen is that we've become far less honest about human nature. So the governmental process that we had prior to mass democracy was honest about some aspects of human nature, that people can do very, very bad things, and often you need some form of reactionary governmental process or process to react after the fact to curtail the worst depravities that the human ape is capable of. But now we've gone so far the other way that we assume that people are just wonderful and majestic, and because we know that there are criminals on possibly every street corner. But what you never want is a situation where that individual who has that criminal tendency or past criminal behavior to have the machinery of the state in their grasp, to have them.
Well, that's the thing, right? And you could have some idiot with an 80 IQ who regularly, clocks people over the head with a baseball bat and robs convenience stores. Hasn't been caught though, for whatever reason, and this guy then can vote. It's a bit strange, but and whether he votes or not, I mean, a lot of us don't even vote. I don't vote anymore. I think it's pointless.
Same here. Well, that great point. I mean, you haven't voted, I'm guessing, for a decade, or possibly even longer.
Almost. The last vote I cast was a kind of sort of rebellious vote for Ron Paul in 2008.
Cool.
That was it.
Cool. And I haven't voted for. In fact, I don't think I voted. Have I actually ever even voted? Possibly once. And it hasn't affected my enjoyment of my life. I was able to, in that time, make a suicidal decision to get married, then get divorced, and now I enjoy myself. I play video games and do whatever. So my life...
Got a man up there, Clive. Shame on you.
But you know what I mean? Like my life quality hasn't been diminished due to my non-participation in the political process.
Yeah, this is something people really need to think about, but unfortunately, I really think the key idea here is this egalitarianism, which has absolutely just ruined society, when it comes to the perspectives on women, when it comes to minorities. All this can be run colorblind and genderblind. If you, in a meritocratic society, of course it's unfair because that's the nature of life, but you don't need, an all-white nation. You don't even necessarily need to exclude women. You just need competent people who can pass whatever examinations are required for whatever the respective job is. That is really all you need to have a well-functioning, well-oiled society. And most of us normal people, and I'm just a normal guy, we're not going to suffer as a result of it. And the guys I used to work with, these dumb as brick guys who talked about, Madrid and Manchester United and probably got into bar fights over football matches. They wouldn't be affected by it either.
Exactly. They would still be able to fight and glass one another over who won the Premier League Cup.
Exactly. So I don't really see what the issue is here, but maybe this is all just too much common sense. For years now, I think, Clive, we can observe that there's been a kind of revolution of thought, mostly going on the internet. I don't know how far it's sort of seeped into mainstream society, but more and more people are waking up to the nightmare of egalitarianism and how just destructive it's been to society. And the fact that, particularly MGTOW-minded men, we know that there's a human nature, that it's definable and understood, can be understood, rather. And this is something, by the way, I just want to say, I know I'm touting my own horn here, but I was instrumental in effectively orchestrating Killdeer to put together that Coltane trilogy, and I'm doing it not for selfish reasons, but because I think it's so important to get the data and the ideas out there. Getting Coltane's content, which is absolutely exceptional, mainstream exposure, and I don't even agree with him on everything, but getting the data out there and presented is so important, because ultimately, if it's possible to change society, and I have my doubts, it's only going to be feasible if we have the evidence and the data available for people to look at. As long as we run around in circles and talk about how stupid Anita Sarkeesian is, that's not going to help.
Agreed.
So, Agreed. Men and women are different. People from different ethnic backgrounds are different. We need to acknowledge that, at the same time, not allow it to just completely dominate our thinking, because ultimately, in a true meritocracy, you can be colorblind and gender blind. I mean, obviously, some people in a true meritocracy. Look at the NBA; it is meritocratic, and you could argue, if you were an egalitarian, that whites have been systematically 25%. It's not even 25%, 75% black, and some admixture of whites and Hispanics and Asians. So
they would say it discriminates against white people and short people. So I for sure couldn't participate in the NBA. I'm merely 6'2".
Well, I'm even shorter. I'm barely 5'9". And a funny joke. Feel free to make fun of me. I was so bad at team sports. I remember when I played in it wasn't Little League baseball, like basketball. I shot a basket and finally got in. I was so ecstatic, and I realized it was my own team's basket. And I looked like such the fool, and I realized that this just isn't for me. So, I think we need to just move past this. All we can do is just hammer away on this topic and just point out what a disaster, whatever your particular point of view is. I think we can agree that egalitarianism has been an utter disaster,
Agreed.
And that's something we need to work on.
Agreed, wholeheartedly.
Okay, I think we've pretty much covered all the bases, as they say in baseball talk. Anything you'd like to add?
No, I'm just very, I guess maybe I'll finally like to say, I'm just very, very glad that we're opening up these avenues. I'm very, very glad that you're providing a ground for these things to be discussed, because for sure within MGTOW, yourself, Barbarossa, Coltane, there's been a great discussion about, gender differences, and now it's important to start discussing the issues of egalitarianism, the fact that, like it or not, human beings are not created equal. That's not to suggest that we round up individuals who are low IQ. Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
Exactly. Just like, someone has chronic depression or anxiety disorder, they need help, and hopefully they'll get it. But they shouldn't be involved in voting or pilots or firemen chiefs or something like that. But I mean, they should be allowed to exist in their own conditions and, attend to their own lives.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And this is one of the reasons why the problem I have with the libertarian realist point of view, as well as any sort of ethnic purist point of view, is it's based on means. They themselves are kind of just operating off of means, whereas what I'm arguing for is a purely meritocratic system where anyone, whatever, race, creed, or even sex for that matter, could potentially at least succeed.
Agreed.
As I've said many times, I care about competence. I don't care about your racial or ethnic background. That's what matters to me.
I agree with you. And it's the same thinking which drives my position. Let's say the presidency of my country, Nigeria, that I really don't care if our president happens to be a Vietnamese woman. I want the most competent person for the job who can help the country achieve its aims. That is my only concern, the outcomes.
Getting back, I mean, I know we're kind of overdue now, but look at Mugabe. I mean, his whole idea was kind of a black nationalist Zimbabwe, which frankly speaking turned out to be a disaster. As you pointed out, the black people didn't have the farming experience of the white people, and yet the white people there were systematically discriminated against and ejected essentially.
Absolutely.
Just because they were of European background.
Precisely.
It's
led to food shortages, hyperinflation. It's led to a flight away from the country. So the actual individuals who were most for the policies have now simply fled because it's turned it into just a backwater wasteland. I mean, the settlers there had the capital to run a farm. And what I guess a lot of people just didn't understand is that running a farm and having products come out, it's not a case of just osmosis. It takes a lot of capital, takes a lot of expertise and a lot of know-how. And Mugabe, like other savages before him, simply failed to realize that things don't happen by magic. I don't just wave abracadabra, towards a plant and then crops then magically, bag themselves, dry themselves and get themselves to market. And I agree with you wholeheartedly that these ideas are ruinous, absolutely ruinous. And as unfortunate as it is, I'm still very, very grateful that we have a real life example of that to point to. So that hopefully we can avoid it again. So hopefully when we get an individual saying, this country needs to be 100% white because it's like, well, no, somebody's tried that and it didn't quite work out. Or we need to have every individual, over the age of 18 voting. Well, actually we've tried that. It simply doesn't work.
In particular, we have just, global evidence to suggest that that's a terrible idea.
For sure.
But I just, I'm continually confronted with a bit of frustration as we absolutely need to inject mainstream society with the truth. That is, that egalitarianism has been probably the most destructive ideological force in human modern civilization, at least.
For sure.
And I just don't know how we're going to get that across. I mean, in circles such as MGTOW and some others, people are aware of this, and even to varying degrees. I mean, obviously there's disagreement there, but there's some sort of rough agreement, even with say white racial nationalists of sorts, that egalitarianism is not true because people are different, ethnicities tend to be different. It's only really in the mainstream, I would argue, where you can't talk about this stuff, and it's unfortunate. And by the way, on a final note, I should be pretty clear, but because I talked to somebody, I largely agree, obviously, with CS, but because I talked to someone like Libertarian Realist doesn't mean I endorse all of his ideas. We really need to get past this idea that having a conversation with someone, because I got all sorts of accusations, including PMs. People angrily unsubbing from me because I'm supposedly a white nationalist. Accusations that my primary concern is the welfare of white European women and their breeding with black people is corrupting. I mean, this is insane. Look at my track record, what I've said about race. And frankly speaking, I don't really care about who fucks who. I mean, I've said this before. So talking to someone doesn't equal an endorsement necessarily. And please listen to the content of the discussion to see where there's disagreement and where there's agreement. That's, I want to give people an open platform within reason to express their ideas. That's super important. We don't have that in mainstream society.
Correct.
That's why I had a talk with someone I don't entirely agree with. Anyway.
Exactly. Well, that's the thing. And part of my criticism towards, let's say, the university system is that there are no platform people who simply disagree with them. For me, an individual should be allowed to express themselves. And I want to listen to that guy who has a difference of opinion. Even just so I can better, understand their ideas, develop counter-arguments if necessary, and also just to better understand the world. We're not islands. People will have differences of opinion, and absolutely.
So I think we've covered, once again, all the bases. I was horrible in baseball, by the way. Always consigned the worst athletic genes on planet Earth. Maybe not the worst, but some of the worst. So consigned to left field, but we did cover all the bases despite that. And check out CS's latest videos. In particular, I was very fond of the refutation of the married men, less crime thing.
Thank you.
There's a lot more that could be talked about that.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll work on a video myself on that topic. And there's more content to come. We'll check you guys out later. And thank you for joining me.
Thank you very, very much. It's been a pleasure to be with you, Stardust.
Okay. Yeah, likewise.
Thank you.